I'll let you know what I think.
Yeah, okay.
That's not. She's not here.
Huh?
I don't believe she's here.
No, he came with the guy who he's sitting next to.
I guess that's their graduate school son. I think that's his son.
Is he that big? Wow. Maybe.
Ed, what are you up to?
I just wanted to find out when you wanted to start. Because we're about 3 minutes before.
How many have you got?
I'm not sure.
Yours sits up front.
How much advance notice do you need? Let's wait a couple of minutes for stragglers. We'll start a couple of minutes
Hey,
after 5.
right here in Jaffrey. Oh my gosh. I should be at the theater, right? Right.
Ed, before I start, I'd like you to give me a count so I'll have an idea how many are on loan.
So you just came up from Key.
Yeah. Did you know Bill Driscoll always wore a fireman's outfit? That's his son in the plaid shirt over there, Sean Driscoll.
I see.
And Bill Driscoll's brother was Edgar Driscoll from the Globe.
Yes. I know that. I know him. It's making me nervous when Becca was turning away people.
Well, we'll start. It's always, you're nervous? I
No,
don't.
I wasn't. I wasn't nervous about this, but when you think you've reached a limit and you turn people away, often people don't show
You're
up.
not going to turn anyway.
Okay.
Hey, Ed.
Well, there she is. That's his wife.
There she is.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just a quick reminder, please be mindful of your cell phones. Good afternoon. My name is David Beltate. I am the current president of the Board of Trustees here at the Jaffrey Civic Center. On behalf of our board and our director, Rebecca Fredrickson, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are pleased to see such a wonderful turnout for the second episode of our second season of Stories to Share. I am delighted to introduce tonight's guest, Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. Ms. Lawrence Lightfoot is a noted educator, sociologist, author, researcher, and lecturer. She graduated from Swarthmore College, which established an endowed fellowship in her name. She went on to earn her PhD from Harvard and joined the faculty in 1972. In 1994, Harvard awarded her the George Ledlie Prize for Research, Most Valuable Contribution to Science, quote, and Benefit of Mankind. In 1984, she received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Prize and thereafter became the first MacArthur Grant recipient to serve as a member and as a chair of the Foundation's board. In 2003, the Academy of Political and Social Sciences named her as, quote, a Margaret Mead Fellow. Ms. Lawrence Lightfoot has many firsts to her credit. She is the first African-American woman in Harvard's history to have an endowed professorship named in her honor. A path-breaking sociologist, she describes herself as a witness, archaeologist, spider woman, storyteller, and mirror, who probes the layers and subtexts of human experience. Listen for the voices and silences. She is author of 11 books and the recipient of 30 honorary degrees from colleges and universities throughout the U.S. and Canada. Our format tonight is conversational. It's different than we've done in the past. Our moderator tonight is Joe Steinfeld. Joe is a longtime local resident, both Jaffrey and Keene. He is an attorney, a graduate of Brown University and Harvard Law, a great contributor to our Civic Center, and a friend. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Ed Watzachek for providing audio and visual capability, and Rebecca Fredrickson, our director, for keeping the JCC and myself organized. Joe, Ms. Lawrence Lightfoot, we look forward to your conversation, and I'll let you take it over from here, Joe. Thank you. If I missed anything, please color it in.
David, thank you very much. Sarah, welcome to Stories to Share, and thank you for sharing your stories. And before we get into those stories, I want to thank all of you for coming, and also the people who are joining us remotely, who can go to the chat line with any questions they may have, and we will try and make time for them, as well as participation from everyone in this very jammed Civic Center meeting room. Sarah, before we turn to some of what you've done, everybody is always interested in other people's roots. Who were their parents? What did they do in their lives? What was it like growing up in your family home? And that's where I'd like to begin.
Good. That's where I'd like to begin. I am the daughter of Charles and Margaret Lawrence. I'm a middle child. I have an older brother, Chuck, a younger sister, Paula. And my parents were professionals. They were academics. My mother, who died at 105 2 years ago, was a pediatrician and then an epidemiologist and then a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. She was the first African-American woman to graduate from Columbia School of Medicine, and she was the only African-American undergraduate at Cornell University between 1928 and 1932. So she had a very, very distinguished career. She was a woman of enormous grace. She was not hard driving and tough, and never cynical. She was just open-hearted and open-minded, and refreshingly hopeful and optimistic. My father was a sociologist and a social activist, and he did very different kind of sociology than I do. I look at very small things. I'm very interested in what's happening on the ground. I'm called a micro-sociologist, right? Interested in people and relationships. My father was a grand scheme meta person who was interested in themes and larger kind of political, social, and cultural issues. He was also a social activist and a peace activist. He was the international president of something called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was a huge peace organization throughout the world. And he was also worked very closely with Thurgood Marshall doing voter registration in the South, and Martin Luther King and the Reverend Shuttlesworth and Reverend Abernathy, the sort of major figures who were the strategists for the civil rights movement. So they were active in the world and active serving the world, as well as active in their own professional lives. They were also amazing parents. My father was a feminist, and that's what he called himself. He did everything that my mother did at home, and they cooked together. Always dinner was the two of them cooking together. And we always sat around the table for dinner, and we sang Grace, 5 musical parts. I was the first soprano, my mother the second soprano, my sister contralto, my father tenor, and my brother bass. And music was very much at the center of our lives. We sang all the time. We played instruments often. And so that was, and the dinner table was where we talked about what was happening with ourselves, where we talked about what was happening in the world. And the people who were our friends and neighbors always said, the Lawrences are always at the dinner table. Every time they came in, we seemed to be there.
Tell me, just to go back a step, how did your parents meet and where?
They both grew up in Mississippi. And my mother in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the daughter of an Episcopal priest and school teacher at St. Mary's Church in Vicksburg, Mississippi. My father grew up in Utica, Mississippi, the daughter of 2 teachers at a black residential school, which was the only school for blacks within 200 miles at the time in Mississippi. And so they both grew up sort of middle class in highly educated families. And at some point, my father's family moved from Utica to Vicksburg, where his father became director of the colored YWCA. That's what it was called. And one summer, my mother came home from Cornell, and she was at the colored YMCA, and my father, very handsome and muscly, is that a word, muscular, was playing tennis. And my mother was looking from above, a balcony above the inside tennis place, and she just fell in love, that's all. That was it. And the rest is really history. I mean, they really, it was just sort of amazing how that relationship grew. And they got married, I guess about 4 years later than that, after they had finished college. And it was the sort of big wedding of middle-class black folks in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And everyone lined the streets. There weren't enough people, there was not enough space inside the church. And so people lined the street and just waited for this young, beautiful, educated, kind of hopeful couple to come up the street. And they were both lovely together. And my grandfather, the Episcopal priest, gave my mother away, and also performed the ceremony. And outside there was a man who we would used to call, I mean, he had mental disability, but in a town of that size, he was, the town idiot, right? Who knew a lot more than anyone imagined, And he stood outside and kept on saying outside the church to the throngs, brains and money, brains and money. That's what it is. And both my parents laughed at that. They said, well, I'm the one with the brains because I sure don't have any money. And my father actually had $7 in his pocket as they went off on their non-honeymoon, where they went off to a college where he was working for the summertime.
Well, I understand that Southerners never ask, what do you do? They always say, where are you from? Or where's your daddy from? And you're from good Southern stock.
Southern stock. And I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. And apparently when I left there at 3, I had a Southern accent, which I've now lost. But there is something about Southern roots and my parents being Southern. I met someone the other day, someone who was waiting on me, and she was a black woman, and I said, just by her style, you must be from the South. And she said, I am, right?
Well, you made it from Tennessee to Swarthmore to Harvard, as David mentioned earlier, and we could spend the entire hour on just one of these subjects, and I don't want to do that, but I'm interested in what it was like for you, almost more at Harvard than at Swarthmore, because you then went on to be a faculty member, and I don't know what the numbers were in terms of African-American women, but I suspect there weren't many. And somehow you negotiated your way through all of that, which must have had both pluses and minuses. So my thought is perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, the educational point in your life, perhaps mentors, if anyone stands out, and what drew you to sociology.
Well, I certainly didn't want to do what my parents did. I grew up thinking, how interesting is that? Having a father who was a sociologist and a mother who was a psychiatrist, sociologists who look at things in the outer world, right? Social relationships, social organizations, psychiatrists who look from the inside out. But I wanted to do something more dramatic, and, I wanted to either do theater or music, or even at some point I thought about dance. So I thought very much about the arts, just as a contrast with my parents, and also because there was so much art in our house as well. There was so much music, and there was so much poetry and storytelling. So I at first thought, that's the direction I would want to go into the arts, which, by the way, both of my kids have gone into, since I didn't get to do it.
But your brother's a lawyer, right?
My brother's a lawyer. My brother's a lawyer, constitutional lawyer who taught most of his career at Stanford, and my sister's an Episcopal priest, like her grandfather.
Let me just focus for a second on a subject that I would find interesting, which is you must have been in the spotlight at Harvard in particular, and very visible, and at the same time, maybe not so visible. I'm not quite sure how to put it, but do you have any?
Well, I think that when you experience tokenism, being one of anything, with very few allies and very few friends who are like you, although I knew that life because I had watched my parents navigate that at Columbia, where they had both been to school. And so I really recognized that the minefields, and I recognized what it took for them, and of course their life was that much harder, because there was much more discrimination, much more segregation in the times that they were in school and in graduate school. So I came to Harvard with no illusions about how easy or how hard it would be, but with, in some ways, a very real idea about the fact that there would be absolutely opportunity in it and a chance to really be in a wonderful university and a chance to have a perch at a university that is unlike any other perch, it seems to me, that you could have. But also understanding that I would be up against perhaps less virulent, less explicit racism, but it was going to still be there. It was going to still be there in terms of my journey through Harvard. And I think one of the things you're pointing to is that as we talked earlier, I said that tokens both experience hypervisibility. Everyone sees you, everyone knows you. Oh, there's Sarah, there's Professor Lawrence Lightfoot. And on the other hand, there's a kind of invisibility as you blend into this sea of whiteness. And when I got there on the faculty, the sea of male whiteness primarily. I think that I was aware from the very beginning that I would have to figure out a way of navigating this somewhat difficult environment. And that I remember my first year teaching, and I started very young. I was 26 years old when I started teaching graduate students who were mostly in their 30s. And I remember feeling up there, because just inadequate to the task, feeling just exposed and vulnerable and not able to do this. Now that's not an unusual feeling for new teachers, particularly new professors who've just graduated and don't know much about teaching and don't really feel yet like a sociologist, right? They haven't, maybe they've mastered their dissertation and they've mastered aspects of the discipline, but they're new to it, and there's so much that you don't know. So I remember feeling inadequate, but I also remember looking out at my students who were then mostly white and mostly male, and looking out at them and having many of them, I don't want to say all of them, sort of looking as if, did my parents spend this money to send me to school to learn from this person? I mean, really? Is that what we're doing here? And I mean, you could just feel that kind of appraisal and of me. And that combined with my own sense of inadequacy was sort of pretty hard. And I remember one guy who, shall remain nameless because he became a famous person and went to Harvard Business School and all of that.
Don't look at me, I didn't go there.
I know, but he could have gone to Harvard Law School, same thing. And he, I remember he kept asking me questions and I kept on getting stumped. Or blathering away at something which I knew wasn't responsive. And finally, I guess about the third or fourth week, I caught on to him, and he asked this question, which wasn't a question. It was a question just to show my inadequacy. And I said out loud to him, I said, Peter, that's not a real question, is it? What do you really want to know? And he looked red and sweaty and nervous. And I was he had no response to that. I went down to the next week because I was feeling so nervous and so inadequate as a teacher and vulnerable. And I went down to watch my dad teach. I said, let me just watch him, because he was just a wonderful pedagogue. And he was teaching a course in Marx, about Marx, at Columbia.
Not Groucho.
No, not Groucho. And he was a Marxist scholar, among other things. And he was, and he didn't know I was coming down. And I called his secretary to find out when he was teaching this. And I paid $16 round trip to go down on the Eastern Shuttle from Boston to New York, and I got there, and I took a cab to Columbia, and I sort of stayed in the seats in the way back. And my father came in, and he asked a question which I thought was so terrifying. He said to this assembled group, about 200 students, "Do you have any questions?" Because I had been so afraid of questions. The fact is that questions are the best part of teaching. And to struggle with students about how you might approach the question, about what kinds of evidence and data you need to gather in order to answer that question, about what questions are absolutely unanswerable, right? And so what I've learned in all these 50 years of teaching, because that's how long it's been, is to really welcome the questions. And if questions are my favorite part of teaching, listening is my second favorite part of teaching. Listening to what students have to say and being responsive to that. So I've learned a lot about teaching. I am now, there's a way in which sort of my position or my role makes no difference to me in my teaching. It's all relational. It's all thinking about who these students are, what's on their minds. And no one in decades has asked me a question which is not a question, which is just designed to cause humiliation and embarrassment. It just hasn't happened because they can't. Because I'll never feel this way again, right? I will always welcome unanswerable, interesting, provocative questions.
Well, that leads me to ask you an answerable question, because you've become prominent. We'll get to the MacArthur grant if we have time, and your role leading the foundation. When we get to it, you can tell us what that is. I know it happened when you were a young mother with young children, 12 years, I think, after you started teaching. And not many of us know MacArthur Fellows. It's a big deal. You can't apply for one, right?
No.
Well, that wasn't my answerable question. Along the way, and we've discussed this, you've run into some interesting people. Not that you're not one of them, which you are, but can you tell us about some of the people whom you've run across in your career who've made a particular impression? People will know or recognize.
That's because it's in your teaser you're doing this question. I think when we talked earlier, because we've had wonderful conversations before about in preparation for this evening, I told you about meeting Nelson Mandela right after he had been released and was free. And he came to the Kennedy Library, and they had a small gathering for him. And I was just blown away. First of all, he's a beautiful, beautiful man, thoughtful and modest, with exacting speech, a lover of language as well, and just exudes kind of justice and wisdom, right? And so who else was there? And this was one of the exciting parts at this, to entertain us was Stevie Wonder. And so he played a piece and then stood in the receiving line as we guests came and met both of them. And he came before, for me, I saw Stevie Wonder and then Nelson Mandela. And so Stevie Wonder, who all of you know has been blind since birth, felt my face twice and said, "So wonderful to see you." I didn't wash my face for weeks. But then he said, Mr. Mandela, she's beautiful. And Mr. Mandela said, she surely is. You got a good eye. So those are two people that I've met at the same time. I listen, as a matter of fact, because I love listening to music, I listened to Stevie Wonder before coming here this evening to be inspired, and Nelson Mandela continues to always be a hero.
You know, I have taught at various universities, and one of the subjects has been how to be a good negotiator. And I begin with Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
The best negotiator, to my knowledge, of the 20th century. And I'll never forget that when Mandela had the opportunity to be released from prison, if only his party, the ANC, would renounce violence, he said no. Mm-hmm. That's good negotiating. And then, no, not until you release everyone else. I will go last. Mm-hmm. That's good negotiating. So he's a hero of mine, too.
Yes, yeah.
Anyone else come to mind? Or should we go on?
We can go on. Yeah.
All right. You told me a story. You wrote a book about your parents, am I right?
About my mother.
About your mother. And I'd like you to share the story of when you took a bus from downtown Boston to Cambridge when your car broke down.
Right. Well, the context for this story is that I write books, unlike many academics, that I hope other people beyond the academy will read. I mean, my purpose is to really start conversations, important conversations about important things that are abroad in the world. And I'm eager to reach wide and diverse audiences. So I try to write, I use a methodology called portraiture, which is a blend of empirical description, good scientific detailed description, and literary narrative, artistic and beautiful writing if I can. That's the idea, to blend and bridge these ways of knowing and seeing and communicating and expressing myself. So I want books to be readable. I want them to be inspiring, and I want them to be beautiful. And so this book is a book that I wrote about my mother, called Balm in Gilead, Journey of a Healer. It is a book that, I don't remember really when it was published, but let's say it was published in 1989. And it was quite broadly read, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list. So it was broadly read by people beyond the academy, but also within the academy. And my 18-year-old Mercedes-Benz that I had inherited from my parents broke down as it kept breaking down, and I couldn't drive to work. And so I took the bus, the #1 bus from Boston South End, where I live, to Cambridge. But I decided to get off in Central Square, which at least used to be the working class square, right? So I would be able to walk some, get some exercise into Harvard Square. And I got off the bus, and I heard this woman banging on a window. And I looked up, and she was a beautician in a cloth blue uniform, I guess. And she was just banging on the window, and she seemed to be...
Was the window a beauty salon?
Of a beauty salon, thank you. A window of a beauty salon. And as I came out the door, this bus had stopped just in front of that, and I thought, well, she certainly isn't trying to... I don't know this woman. She's not trying to notify me or get to me. And so I got off the bus and started up the street. And a little while later, I heard screaming from this woman. She had come out of the beauty parlor, and she was saying, "Stop that woman! Stop that woman! The woman with the woman with the combs in her hair." when I don't wear a head scarf, I wear combs in my hair. And I said, oh my God, combs in my hair. She means me. Now, there was something about her screaming that didn't scare me. I wasn't terrified. I just thought she was urgent. She needed me to stop. So I stopped, and she came right around in front of me and was right up in my face. And she said, "You'll never guess where I am." I said, I'm in Central Square. Where are you? And she said, I'm in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And guess what? Margaret has just seen Charles play tennis. And I think she's falling in love. She said it is, I'm so excited. This is so spectacular and amazing. I said, I think she is falling in love. And we went through that a little bit. Now, this was not necessarily a person who I hope to reach with my work. She has just graduated from Cambridge Ringe and Latin High School, and her boyfriend is a trucker who at Christmas time went into the booksellers in Harvard Square and said, "Give me something in a love story." And they gave him Balm and Gilead. And she said that she and the trucker, when he's home, they read it to one another. And she's learning about a life she's never known, and she would never know. But she is feeling just deeply identified with who these people are. And she's in love too, by the way, with a handsome man. And maybe they can make it. You know, so I'm always hoping with my work that I will be introducing people to worlds that seem at first foreign, seem at first exotic. And then as you get into the story, you recognize yourself. I felt that too. I feel hungry. You know, I feel grief. I feel joy. I feel insecure. I feel vulnerable. You know, I feel just like she does. But that this woman was wonderful. She was wonderful. And it just showed how powerful, right? How powerful books can be and how they go so far beyond anything that you can imagine yourself doing personally.
Well, the moral of the story is next time your car breaks down, take the bus. Speaking of books, I brought one with me. One of your books, the third chapter, Passion, Risk, and Adventure in the 25 Years After 50. Well, that lets me out, but it includes quite a few people here, and I'm happy to see some of the people in the room have not yet reached the third chapter. What motivated you to write about, you were in the third chapter when you wrote the book, right?
That's right.
You haven't written the fourth chapter yet?
No,
All
I
right.
don't intend to.
Well, shucks. Tell us about either this book or another book other than Balm and Gilead.
Yeah.
And if one of us wanted to read one book of yours, which one should we read?
Oh, for heaven's sakes. That's
She's
not
not
a good
prepared for
question.
that question.
I was
That's
going to say, no, that's not a good question, counselor.
strike the question. What can you tell us
I-
about this book?
This book is, in terms of the scholarship of it and why I wanted to do this, was because there's lots of scholarly work by human developmentalists about babies and infants, about young children, about adolescents, even about young adults. But then it sort of drops off, as if people are going to all remain the same forever. Once they get grown, we're all going to be just fine, the same way we were. Well, everyone in this room, in their third or fourth chapters, knows that isn't true. We continue to live, we continue to learn, and there are even, I really do not think that there's any particular moment in life when it's best to learn, right? And so I decided to I spent 3 years interviewing men and women in their third chapters, and interviewing those men and women who were doing something new, learning something new, taking a great adventure in their lives, taking risks. And I not only interviewed them, but I watched them do that. So someone who was the editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune and retires and decides to learn to play the jazz piano, right? And so I go to his lessons, I go and listen to him play, I listen to him talk about the experience of learning something new, and the vulnerability that he experiences in learning something new, and the urgency at the same time as the patience he has for learning something new. I mean, or someone who is for the first time doing her half marathon. She's never done anything athletic in her whole life and has decided at 63 to do a half marathon. And so these are all people making major transformations in their lives. And part of what this shows is that we continue to change and we continue to stay the same, you know. In other words, there's both this incredible reservoir of deep experience, and we know the things that we know well. But then there are things to be learned still forever and ever. And one of the, I think, so I was interested in this, and it is one of the few books, really, it was one of the first books that explored this developmental moment, these developmental moments.
Well, speaking of moments and important moments, the MacArthur Foundation recognized you with what's called a Genius Grant. I'm not sure what the official name is, but that's the popular term for it. And as I said before, probably you're the only MacArthur Grant recipient that we know, most of us. And I'm not sure all of us know exactly what it is, how you get it, what it means. And in your case, what you then did, both in this country and elsewhere, when you became the chairman of that foundation at a later time. So can you give us a kind of overview of that?
Well, the MacArthur Foundation is one of 4 or 5 leading international foundations in the world. And it works in 62 countries in the world. It has 8 offices, you know, in around the world. And it has both a domestic programs, and international programs. And one of the programs that it's best known for, that everyone seems to know about, is this, quote, Genius Award. And it started, I think, in 1982, right? And it continues today. And there is a board, a selection committee, and they receive nominations from secret nominators. Everything is very hush-hush, very mysterious about this. And so you may be nominated by a number of people you have no idea you've been nominated. You have no idea that they've been looking at you for a number of years. It's really about creativity and breaking the boundaries. It's sort of path-breaking work in a number of fields. I mean, activists and artists and academics and, you know, the range of people. Just one day you get a call. And that one day was in 1983, because I was in the second group that got this award. I was in California doing a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. I wasn't doing much because I just had a 3-month-old baby and a 2.5-year-old child. And I imagined that what I would be doing that year out in California is sort of raising children and playing tennis. That's what I really wanted to do. I just finished a big book. And And I thought, this will be wonderful to do in the sunshine of California. I came into the center, and there was a phone call from someone named Dr. Hope.
Hope. You were in California.
Yeah, I was at the center. there.
Bob Hope.
No. Like not Groucho Marx. It's not, neither of those people. I don't know either of those people.
You can see we occupy different universes. So Dr. Hope.
Dr. Hope called, left a message. And this is way before cell phones, right? This is before, as a matter of fact, the people who were, scholars who were working at this center, they didn't allow us to have phones in our office because they thought that would be a distraction. So there were phones, there were phones sort of between the offices that you had to go outside. So I picked up the message and I called Dr. Hope back, and he was at the MacArthur Foundation. And he told me the stunning, shocking, most amazing news I had ever heard, which is you've just won a MacArthur. And this is, you don't apply for this. It's a 5-year gift, manna from heaven. You can use it on a Ferrari if you want to, or a Steinway piano. I used it on research, right? But I started, I really was without words, sort of stuttering and sweating, perspiring, and my knees were buckling as I responded in excitement to this. And then I tried to say thank you. I think I said thank you, and he said there'll be a telegram or in coming to you. I just wanted to let you know. And as soon as he hung up, I got very still and very quiet. And out of my mouth came these words, "Good Sarah, you can write a book about your mother." Now, I don't usually call myself Sarah, and this is not usually where my research ideas come from. But this must have been an imperative deep inside of me. I had always been known as my father's daughter. I look like my father. I'm a sociologist. I teach like my dad. But I had obviously developed a huge appreciation and amazement for my mother once I became a mother myself, and how she managed to balance this incredibly complex life, and how she was devoted to everything that she did. And so I then kept that a secret that I wanted to do that for about a year before I rounded my family and said, is it okay if I do this?
Well, before you get to that, who's the first person you
I called my parents. You are able to, you can't tell anyone about this until it's published, right? But they said you could tell your parents or your spouses. So I called my parents, and my dad answered, "How you doing, girl?" I said, "I'm doing very well. Guess what?" And I told him about this incredible gift. And he did not hoot and holler and say hallelujah. He got very sober, and he said, "Oh my God, girl, what a responsibility." This was my father. Anyone gives you that kind of gift, boy, are you going to have to give for the rest of your life. And so I'm sure my mother would have said something similar, but it was just so, I was a little sad that he didn't hoot and holler and say hallelujah, but I knew my father, and that was a central kind of value of our family.
Well, we're at the point where I'd like to ask for questions. We know from our guest, who, by the way, lives here in Jaffrey part of the time. I don't know whether everyone is aware of that, and has been our neighbor, Virginia's and mine, for many years here in Jaffrey. And I'm happy to see some other neighbors here tonight. I'm even looking around at them. And
Well represented.
well, I'll be having a word with the ones that are not here. Now, please, questions. Anybody? Yes, would you stand and speak loudly?
Yes, I heard you talking about your family dinners, and that you left Nashville at 3, and suddenly you're in poverty. There's a spot in between which
Yeah.
I'm familiar with, Pomona,
Yeah.
Spring Valley.
Absolutely.
And I'd like you to tell about Spring Valley.
About, yeah.
Spring Valley, I graduated in '63 with Paul,
Oh, my goodness gracious, mercy my oh me.
and I ran track with Chuck.
Okay, so I hope I tell it right then. Tell us your name.
It's Rostig.
Rusty?
Rostig.
Rostig.
R-O-S-T-I.
Okay, okay,
Rostislav. is the-
okay, okay. And whose class were you in?
63, I was.
In Paula's class?
Paula's class. yeah.
Okay,
She-
so Paula's
and-
my younger sister,
And she was
and-
president of our class.
yes.
And you were president of your class.
And Chuck was
And
president
Chuck
of
was
his, yeah, that's right. As a matter of fact, and Chuck ran track, and he was captain of the track team, he was captain of the football team, and he was captain of the basketball team. And when we played instruments, and we did a little bit of touring, but mostly it was local, and my father decided after we all became presidents of our class to call us the presidential suite. So that's what we did. So 3 years old, I left Nashville, and so my mother had us. My brother Charles is 17 months older, and my sister Paula is 17 months younger. And so we were all very, very close, and we continue to be very close friends. My brother and my sister are my best friends, for sure. And we moved to New York, to Queens, actually, as my mother finished her training in psychiatry and psychoanalysis, as my father finished his PhD in sociology, and as they worked to support our family, and then we moved to a community that my parents helped start called Skyview Acres Cooperative Community. And it was full of a bunch of people who were largely progressive people, activist folks. There were 5 families who started this community, and my father knew them through his peace work. My father had been a conscientious objector during World War II, and most of these people were his comrades in that struggle. And they decided to start a community that was intentionally inclusive. This is at a time, even in the North, when most communities were highly segregated, and they wanted a place where people of all kinds could live together. And so we moved out to the country, and they began to build this community, which was a really an amazing, amazing project. By the way, Skyview Acres Cooperative Community is still thriving today and going very strong. And it grew to be 44 families. And when we moved out to the country, we were surrounded, this little community was surrounded largely by apple orchards. It was real country, and my brother and sister and I went to a little public school called English Church School. It was a public school, a 2-room schoolhouse. So we spent our first few years in a 2-room schoolhouse. And then we went to Spring Valley, to South Main Street School for junior high school, and to the Spring Valley High School, where we were all together. And it was wouldn't you say, an okay suburban, by then, suburban public school. Do you want me to say, that catches us up, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for asking the question.
Yeah, I was interested, actually. in
Other
5U8.
questions?
Yes.
Anyone at all? I have a question, but I'd rather hear from somebody in the audience.
This is someone over here, has it?
Yes,
I'm just curious.
could you stand up, please, and speak loudly?
Hi, Peggy Ueno.
Oh, well, my partner of many years lived in New York, and I lived in Boston. And this was a great long-distance love affair. I recommend it to anyone. But we did want a wee place, a place where we could come together on weekends, on vacations, and so forth. And so we began looking around at all kinds of places and really knew nothing about the Monadnock region. You know, most of our experience in New Hampshire was up around Squam or, further north. And then I was on the board of WGBH, and I was sitting around with other people on the board, all who have a lot more money than I do and deep pockets, and they were having a conversation about where they have their second and their third and their fourth homes, you know. And I was listening in, and someone said, thinking that I was an interesting person, where's your home? They didn't mean Boston. They meant, where is your second? And so I thought I can do one of two things. I can pretend that I have one and make up a story, or I can use these people as a resource. So I did. I said, I don't, but we're looking for a place within 2 hours of Boston, right? That's lovely, and I love swimming more than anything else, and I love lakes more than anything else. They make me feel peaceful and still. And there was a person who wasn't on the board and wasn't one of the wealthy heavy hitters, but she was a producer of a children's show, and she was there, and she said, I rent a place in Francistown every summer, and that is heaven. That region is heaven. And she promised I thought it was a throwaway line, but she promised to send me information about realtors and towns. And this is before emails and all that. So that meant snail mail. And by goodness, she did. And we came up here and we began looking and found this absolutely magical space and spot. And we moved in, and it's a wonderful, wonderful place to live. And I'm so thankful to all of you who have come out to listen to all these stories tonight. I am, and it's nice to have a crowd. Bill called me a rock star of Jaffrey, right?
Well, I can't call you a rock star. Anyone else? We're going to have a reception. Sarah's going to stick around so people can chat with her. I want to turn to one serious question and just ask you for your thinking in a minute or two, because it's all over the news. And you've lived through 50 years at Harvard. Harvard's lawyers were in the Supreme Court. This is the lawyer in me, I guess, speaking. Over the whole subject of affirmative action. And it's not hard to read the tea leaves, in my view, what this court will do over Harvard's affirmative action program and that of the University of North Carolina. The justices have been pretty clear that they believe affirmative action's day is over. However, from an educator's point of view, and as a sociologist, what's your thinking?
I think the future on this is terrible, just like it was on Roe v. Wade, as far as I'm concerned. Terrible, terrible decision that's coming up. We've been talking about family and generations. When my mother graduated from Cornell in 1932, she was a pre-med student. She couldn't, her whole college career, she couldn't live in the dorms because she was black. She lived as a maid in various faculty homes, often having to go home and put on a uniform in order to serve lunch. And she was the only black undergraduate. However, she managed, because she's a science nerd, she managed to ace ace her way through all the pre-med courses, and I know that because I still have her grades. And so she applied to Cornell Medical School, which at that time was, if you went to college, a college like Cornell, a university, and then undergraduate, then it was pretty sure that you'd get into the medical school if you had all A's, all grades. And so she applied, and she was called in later by the dean, and the dean told her that she had had an extraordinary record there. It's amazing. He congratulated her for that. He said, but we've really deliberated very hard, and we've really thought very hard about all this, and we've decided not to admit you. He said, 25 years ago, we admitted a black man, and it didn't work out. But this is the kicker. He got tuberculosis.
You got to work what?
Tuberculosis.
Oh.
And so